The loner rancher waited for his mail-order bride, and a woman twice his size stepped off the wagon. The air on Jedediah Kane's land was desolate, thick with solitude, grim purpose, and a silence that screamed. Carved from granite and regret, he stood beside the dusty track, his gaze fixed on the horizon. He wasn't waiting for love. He was waiting for a transaction. He'd ordered a mail-order bride like he'd order a new plow, a functional piece of equipment to fill the void on his ranch and in his life. He didn't need some fancy calico queen. He needed a quiet helpmate. The phantom ache in his leg, a bitter ghost from a bloody past at Shiloh, was a constant reminder of why he despised complications. Then he saw it. A plume of dust. The stagecoach. His solution had arrived, paid for in cold, hard cash. He'd bargained for a woman to help him break the unforgiving hardpan soil. But as the wagon door creaked open, he knew instantly he'd gotten more than he'd ever bargained for. What stepped out wasn't a wife. It was a reckoning twice his size. The world was the color of rust and bone. Jedediah Kane watched the stagecoach materialize from the heat shimmer, a dark, lumbering beast kicking up the very dust he felt in his soul. This was it, the transaction. He'd paid the fee, signed the letter, and waited 4 long months for this solution. His knuckles were white where he gripped the wagon reins, the leather worn, as smooth as his patience. He had a ranch to run, fences to mend, and a silence in his cabin so loud it echoed the hollowness Shiloh had carved inside him. He didn't need a wife. He needed an extra hand, a quiet presence to fill the space where ghosts whispered. The stagecoach groaned to a halt, the horses blowing their flanks slick with sweat. The driver, a leathery old-timer named Gus, spat a stream of tobacco juice. "Got your delivery, Kane, all the way from St. Louis." Jedediah just nodded, his eyes fixed on the door. He'd sent for a woman of sturdy stock and pleasant temperament. He pictured someone plain, quiet, and grateful, someone who would understand her place. The door creaked open. A boot appeared first. It was not a delicate buttoned thing. It was a thick-soled leather work boot, scuffed and solid, that planted itself in the dust with authority. Then came the rest of her. She had to duck to get through the door, her shoulders nearly filling the frame. She was tall, taller than him by a hand's breadth, and built not with the soft curves of a woman but with the solid lines of an oak tree. Her dress, a simple dark calico, was stretched taut across a broad back and strong arms. Her face, framed by a cascade of unruly auburn hair pulled back in a simple bun, was not delicate. It was handsome, with a square jaw, a wide, determined mouth, and eyes the color of a stormy sea. The silence on the road was absolute, broken only by the buzzing of a fly. Jedediah felt a hot, prickling shame crawl up his neck. The few onlookers from the trading post were staring. This wasn't a solution. This was a spectacle, a joke at his expense. "There's been a mistake," Jedediah said, his voice flat and hard as the hardpan earth beneath them. The woman's stormy eyes met his. There was no fear in them, no apology, only a deep, unnerving calm. "Are you Mr. Jedediah Kane?" she asked. Her voice was low and steady, with none of the simpering deference he'd expected. "I am." She held out a letter, the paper crisp despite the journey. "Then there is no mistake. I am Martha O'Connell, your wife." The word hung in the air like a death sentence. "I'll pay your passage back," he bit out the words, tasting like poison. "I'm not for sale, Mr. Kane," she replied, her voice dropping a fraction of a degree colder. "And I do not go back." Gus the driver cleared his throat. "Her trunk, Kane. It's a heavy one." "She can leave it," Jedediah growled, turning toward his wagon, a clear act of dismissal. He wouldn't be a part of this humiliation. He would drive away, leave her standing in the dust. A problem to be sent back, return to sender. He heard a grunt behind him, not of distress, but of effort. He turned back, his jaw tight with irritation, and froze. Martha O'Connell had grabbed the handles of her enormous wooden trunk, a trunk that had likely taken 2 men to load, and with a single powerful heave, she lifted it from the stagecoach and settled it onto the ground with a solid thump. The muscles in her arms and back bunched under the calico. She didn't even look winded. She just wiped her hands on her dress and looked at him, one eyebrow slightly raised. A challenge. A current of something he couldn't name: shock, reluctant awe, pure fury shot through him. The whispers from the trading post grew louder. Defeated, and with a rage so cold it felt like ice in his veins, he motioned with his head toward his wagon. Get in. The ride to the ranch was a war of silence. She sat beside him, a mountain of quiet resolve, her presence a physical weight pressing on him. He pointed out nothing, offered no words. He let the harsh, unforgiving landscape speak for him. This is your new home, the cracked earth and skeletal trees seemed to say. A place where things come to die. He hoped she understood. He hoped she would break. But as they pulled up to the grim-weathered cabin he called home, she simply looked at it, her expression unreadable. Then her gaze swept over the patch of dead, sun-baked earth he'd once tried to make a garden. The soil is poor, she said, her first words since the road. But it's not dead. It just needs a stronger hand. She looked from the dead garden to him, and in that moment Jedediah Kane knew his fight had only just begun. Jedediah paid for a worker, but got a warrior. Is his pride blinding him to the partner he desperately needs? Or is Martha a complication he's right to fear? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Hit that like button if you felt that silence on the wagon ride, and subscribe. Jedediah ignored her comment about the soil, the words an unwelcome ember in the cold ash of his cabin. He grabbed her trunk, the wood groaning under the strain, and hauled it inside with a grunt, the effort a stubborn denial of the ease with which she had handled it. The air inside was stale, thick with the scent of dust, solitude, and old sorrows. Light struggled through a single grimy window, illuminating a world stripped to its bare essentials: a stone hearth, a crude table, 2 chairs, and the ghosts of 1,000 silent meals. This was his fortress, his tomb. "This is your room," he said, kicking open a door to a space little bigger than a closet, containing a narrow cot and a single nail on the wall for her things. He set the trunk down with a thud that shook the floorboards. "The well is out back. The wood needs splitting. I expect breakfast at dawn." He laid out the rules like a warden, drawing lines she was not to cross. He was the master of this desolate kingdom. He had to be. Martha simply looked at the small, bleak room, her gaze sweeping over the cot, and gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. No complaint, no sigh. The lack of reaction was more infuriating than any argument. It was as if she had expected this, or worse. He turned away, the transaction complete in his mind. Now for the slow, grinding work of making her regret it. That evening, he slapped a slab of salted jerky and 2 hard biscuits on the table. A soldier's meal, a survivor's meal. It was what he had eaten for years, a penance he paid for a crime no one else remembered. It was food that kept you alive, but never once reminded you that you were living. "It's all I have," he mumbled, a justification that sounded weak even to his own ears. Martha looked at the meager offering, then at the fire in the hearth. She didn't touch the jerky. Instead, she rose and moved to the small pantry. Jedediah watched every muscle tense as her large, capable hands rummaged through his supplies. She found a near-forgotten sack of flour, a tin of lard, a handful of shriveled onions. To him, it was a collection of last resorts. To her, it was a beginning. She moved around his hearth with a quiet efficiency that was both a marvel and an invasion. The scent of frying onions soon filled the cabin, a warm, savory aroma so foreign it felt like a trespasser. It was a smell of life, of home, and it clawed at a part of him he'd thought long dead. She made a thick, gravy, pan-fried biscuits that rose fluffy and golden, and revived the jerky in boiling water until it was tender. She placed a plate in front of him. It was a real meal. Steam rose from it, carrying the scent of a life he had left behind. He ate. He hated himself for it. Each bite was a surrender. The food was not just sustenance, it was a comfort, a warmth that spread through his cold gut and shamed him. He ate in a stony, resentful silence, refusing to meet her eyes. She ate with a quiet dignity, as if dining in a fine restaurant instead of a dusty shack at the edge of the world. The silence that fell between them was different now. It was no longer just empty. It was filled with the scent of her cooking, with the undeniable fact of her presence. She had taken the dead things in his home and made them live. Suddenly, a sound cut through the night. Crack, crack, crack. Distant rifle shots. Jedediah was on his feet in an instant, the half-eaten biscuit forgotten in his hand. His body went rigid, the old soldier instincts snapping to the surface. He moved to the door, peering through a crack in the wood. "What is it?" Martha's voice was calm, cutting through his tension. "Nothing," he lied, his eyes scanning the dark ridgeline. "Coyotes." It wasn't coyotes. The shots were too deliberate. It was Silas Croft's men, a reminder. A threat whispered on the wind, pushing at his borders, testing his defenses. They were always there, vultures circling, waiting for him to weaken, waiting for him to fail. He felt the familiar coil of cold fury in his stomach. He turned back from the door, his hand instinctively going to the old rifle mounted over the hearth. That was his answer. His only answer. But Martha wasn't looking at the door. She wasn't looking at him. Her gaze had returned to the single grimy window that overlooked the dead garden patch. She was quiet for a long moment, the rifle shots still echoing in the distance. "Tomorrow," she said softly, more to herself than to him, "I will need a spade. That ground will need turning before the first rain if anything is to grow." Jedediah stared at her. He was thinking of bullets and borders of death and defense. She was thinking of seeds. Dawn broke cold and sharp. Jedediah rose from his cot, the familiar ache in his bones a grim companion. He moved to the hearth, expecting to find the embers dead, the cabin still wrapped in the chill of the night. But the fire was already alive. A small, steady flame danced in the hearth, and a pot of coffee, black and strong, was already brewing its rich scent, a stark contrast to the usual morning smell of stale air. Martha was not in the cabin. He looked through the window and saw her by the woodpile, the axe rising and falling with a powerful rhythmic grace that sent chips of pine flying. She was already working, not waiting for his command, but acting with a purpose that was entirely her own. A fresh surge of irritation, mingled with something he refused to name, churned in his gut. He drank the coffee. It was good. He hated that it was good. After a silent breakfast, she looked at him. The spade. He jerked his head toward the lean-to, shed a silent, grudging permission. He watched her retrieve the tool, its iron head rusted from disuse. He fully expected her to last an hour, maybe two, before the unforgiving sun-baked hardpan defeated her. He'd tried to break that same patch of earth himself years ago, and his own back had nearly broken in the process. He grabbed his tools and headed for the far western fence line a section a winter storm had tried to tear down. A man's work, a real problem. But all morning he found his eyes drifting back toward the cabin. He could hear it even from a distance. The steady, relentless thunk of the spade hitting the earth, a sound of sheer, unyielding will. He saw her silhouette against the blazing sun, a solitary, powerful figure locked in a battle with his dead land. The sun climbed higher, beating down with a merciless intensity. He stopped for water, his own throat parched. She did not stop. The rhythm of her work was a slow, powerful heartbeat against the silence of the plains. He saw her shift her weight, using her entire body to drive the spade down. He saw the sweat stain the back of her calico dress. He saw her pause only to wipe her brow with a forearm, then immediately resume her assault. A strange and unwelcome feeling began to take root in him. It was respect. He who respected nothing but hard work and survival was watching a display of both so profound it shamed his own cynicism. He was watching a woman refuse to be broken by the very land that had broken him. Around noon he saw two riders approaching, not from the main track but cutting across the plains from the north, from Silas Croft's territory. Jedediah's hand went still on the fence wire, his body tensing. Trouble. He watched as they reined in their horses near the garden patch, leering down at Martha. They were wiry, mean-looking men, the kind Croft kept on his payroll for jobs that required cruelty over skill. Well, now look what Kane's got himself. One of them drawled, his voice carrying on the wind. A workhorse. Bet she can plow a field all on her own. The other man laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. Big as a barn door, ain't she? What's the matter? Kane couldn't find a woman, so you bought an ox. Jedediah felt the blood rush to his face, a hot, violent tide. He had wanted her gone. He had resented her presence. But to hear these vultures mock her on his land, something snapped. He dropped his tools and began walking toward them, his stride long and dangerous. Martha had stopped working. She stood straight, leaning on the spade, her face impassive. She didn't look scared. She looked annoyed. "You men are trespassing," she said, her low voice carrying a surprising weight of command. "Trespassing." The first man sneered, dismounting. "This here is Croft land, or will be soon enough. We just came to see the new livestock." He took a step toward her. "That's far enough." Jedediah's voice was a low growl. The men turned, surprised to see him so close. "Stay out of this, Kane," the second rider warned. "We just want to have a word with your bride." Jedediah stopped, placing himself between them and Martha. He looked at their smug, cruel faces, and he thought of the steady rhythmic beat of her spade, of her tireless work under the sun. He thought of her dignity. "She is Mrs. Kane." He said the words, feeling foreign but solid on his tongue. "And this is my land. Get off it. Now." The dismounted man took another step, his hand dropping to the pistol at his hip. "Or what old man you and your giantess gonna throw rocks at us?" Before Jedediah could move, Martha took one step to the side. She wasn't hiding behind him. She was standing with him. She hefted the heavy spade in her hands, its sharp edge glinting in the sun. She said nothing. She just held it and looked at the man with those stormy, unflinching eyes. The sight of them, the grim, determined rancher and the formidable woman with a tool that looked an awful lot like a weapon, gave the men pause. This wasn't the broken loner they were used to taunting. This was a united front. With a final curse, the man remounted. "Croft's gonna hear about this," he spat. "He ain't gonna be happy." They spurred their horses and galloped away, leaving a cloud of dust and threats hanging in the air. Jedediah stood for a long moment, the adrenaline slowly receding. He turned and looked at Martha. She was still holding the spade, her knuckles white. Their eyes met over the broken, stubborn earth she was determined to bring back to life. He gave a short, sharp nod, a gesture of acknowledgement so small it was almost invisible. But she saw it, and in the tense silence they both knew the truth. The fight with Silas Croft was no longer just his. It was theirs. A truce fragile as a spider's thread settled over the ranch. Words remained scarce, but the silence between them now held a different quality. It was a shared watchfulness, the quiet understanding of soldiers in a trench before an assault. Jedediah found himself watching her not with scorn but with a wary, grudging curiosity. He watched as she transformed the dead patch of earth, her spade breaking the stubborn ground he'd long since surrendered to. He watched as she moved about his desolate cabin, bringing a semblance of order of life to the dusty corners. They worked. He reset the fence posts. Croft's men had loosened his hammer blows, echoing a hard, angry rhythm. She, having conquered the garden plot, turned her attention to the leaking roof of the barn, her strength making a mockery of the ladder as she hauled shingles to the top. They were two separate forces orbiting each other in a tense, unspoken partnership, their shared defiance a shield against the coming storm. The storm arrived on the third night. It began not with rain, but with a feeling. A deep, unnatural stillness fell upon the plains. The chirping of the crickets ceased. The wind died, leaving the air heavy expectant. Jedediah felt it in the marrow of his bones, the same electric dread he'd felt in the moments before an ambush. "Something's wrong," he said, his voice low, as he stood on the cabin porch, his rifle in hand. Martha came to stand beside him, her large frame a solid presence in the unnerving quiet. She sniffed the air. "Smoke," she whispered, but not from a campfire. Then came the sound. It was a low, distant rumble, at first a vibration felt more in the chest than heard with the ears. A sound like the earth itself was groaning. It grew steadily, a deep, primal roar that seemed to shake the very foundations of the world. Jedediah knew that sound. It was the devil's own heartbeat. It was the sound of 1,000 panicked hooves. Stampede, he breathed the word, a curse. Out of the darkness to the north, a massive, churning wave of shadow and horn appeared, a living avalanche of terrified cattle aimed directly at their small, vulnerable ranch. He could see the faint glow of fire behind them, the work of Croft's men driving the herd using his own livestock as a battering ram to wipe him off the map. There was no time to think, only to act. "Get inside, bar the door!" He roared at Martha. But he did not run for the cabin. He ran for the corral for his horse, the old soldier and him taking over. He had to turn them. It was a fool's errand, 1 man against 1,000, but it was the only move he had. He swung into the saddle, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs, and galloped toward the terrifying oncoming tide. He fired his pistol into the air, the sharp cracks swallowed by the thunder of the herd. He screamed until his throat was raw, trying to turn the lead steers. The air was thick with dust and the hot, panicked scent of the animals. For a heart-stopping moment, he thought it was working. The edge of the herd began to veer. Then his world tilted. A massive steer, its eyes white with terror, slammed into his horse's flank. The animal went down with a high-pained shriek, and Jedediah was thrown clear, his leg twisting under him as he hit the ground. A sharp, blinding pain shot up from his ankle to his hip, a sickening snap that drowned out even the roar of the stampede. His leg was broken. He was helpless, a broken piece of driftwood in the path of a tidal wave. He pushed himself up on his elbows, the world a dizzying swirl of dust and horns and pain. The herd, its course corrected, was now thundering directly toward the cabin. Toward her. He saw it all in a horrifying slow-motion clarity, the splintering of wood, the collapse of his home, her body crushed beneath the unstoppable force. "Martha!" He screamed, a raw, desperate cry of pure terror. Through the choking dust, he saw the cabin door fly open. But she didn't run. She didn't cower. Martha emerged, 2 lit kerosene lanterns in her hands, her face a mask of grim determination. She ran not away but directly toward the edge of the oncoming herd, a single, defiant figure against a wave of death. With a powerful heave, she swung the lanterns one after the other into a patch of dry brush just ahead of the lead steers. The brush ignited with a hungry whoosh, a sudden wall of brilliant, terrifying flame erupting in the darkness. The lead animals, already panicked, saw the fire and shied away violently, turning, forcing the animals behind them to turn as well. The great wave of cattle split a river of flesh and bone, dividing around the small island of the cabin, their thunderous passage shaking the very ground he lay upon. The last of the herd crashed past. And then an almost deafening silence. Through the settling dust under the pale, indifferent light of the moon, Jedediah lay broken. He looked at the smoking wall of brush, at his miraculously intact cabin, and then at the figure walking toward him out of the darkness. It was Martha, her face smudged with soot, her stormy eyes wide with the fear she had not shown a moment before. He looked up at the woman he had scorned, the woman who had just saved everything he had in the world. The searing pain in his leg was nothing compared to the profound, shattering realization in his heart. He was helpless. The ranch was in ruins, and she was all he had left. Pain was a white-hot sun exploding behind his eyes. Jedediah's world had been reduced to two things: the grinding agony in his shattered leg and the steady, solid presence of Martha leaning over him. The thunder of hooves had been replaced by the thunder of blood in his ears. "Don't move," she commanded, her voice a low, calm anchor in his swirling sea of pain. He felt a profound, soul-crushing humiliation. He, Jedediah Kane, who had survived the horrors of war and the cruelty of the frontier, was now as helpless as a newborn kitten. He was a liability. He was broken. The cabin— He rasped, his throat raw with dust. "Is standing," she said. "Now help me." Getting him back to the house was a grim, agonizing journey. He leaned on her, his arms slung over her broad shoulders, and felt the sheer solid power in her frame. The strength he had once viewed as monstrous was now the only thing keeping him from collapsing into the dirt. Each step was a fresh wave of torture, but her grip was firm, her pace steady. She did not falter. She did not complain. She simply bore his weight, her own and his, and moved forward. Inside, she laid him on his own cot, the irony a bitter taste in his mouth. She worked with a grim purpose, tearing strips from a clean sheet, her movements deft and sure. "This will hurt," she stated, not as an apology, but as a fact. She handed him a thick leather strap from a broken saddle harness. "Bite down." He stared at her, a question in his pain-filled eyes. Where had she learned this? But he was in no position to ask. He clamped his teeth down on the leather as she knelt, her strong hands finding the break in his leg. He saw her jaw tighten, her eyes narrow in concentration. She took a deep breath and pulled. A scream, raw and inhuman, was ripped from his throat, muffled by the leather. The world dissolved into a universe of pure, white agony. He felt the bones grate, then slide into place with a sickening pop. Then darkness claimed him for a moment. When he came to, she was splinting the leg with two sturdy pieces of firewood, her wrapping tight and professional. The immediate sharp pain had been replaced by a deep, throbbing ache. He was alive. He was crippled. The days that followed were a special kind of hell. Confined to the cot, Jedediah was forced to watch as Martha single-handedly tried to hold the ruined ranch together. She cleared the debris from the stampede, repaired the shattered corral, and tended to the terrified, scattered remnants of his herd. She worked from before sunrise to long after sunset, fueled by a strength that seemed limitless. And all the while, the true threat was tightening its grip. On the third day, she returned from the creek, her face grim. "It's no use," she said, setting down the nearly empty buckets. "The water is just a trickle, and it's muddy. Something is blocking it upstream." Croft. It was his final move. The stampede had failed to destroy them, so now he would choke them out. Without water, the remaining cattle would die. The garden she had fought so hard to cultivate would wither. They would be forced to abandon the ranch or die of thirst. A cold, hard despair, heavier than any he had ever known, settled over Jedediah. It was over.